Good afternoon, conference. Thank you, VJ. Thank you to you and your committee. I'm sure there's been an awful lot of work, blood, sweat and tears in the last year to deliver the conference, and I'm sure Birmingham LDC Conference 2019 will be a great success. It's good to be back in my university city. It's certainly changed a bit since the days of Duran Duran at the Rum Runner Club just down the road in the 1980s, and a sparkling new dental school as well, so that's great news, I think. Now, for the very observant of you, we are not Henrik. Together. We are still not Henrik. So Henrik's business address has obviously moved from Wimpole Street to Brussels. But what we would like to both do on behalf of everybody is to thank Henrik for all of his years of hard work, dedication and commitment on behalf of the profession. So thank you, Henrik.
Yes, we've been vice chairs with Henrik for 4.5 years now, and Henrik was a really, really inclusive chair, and that was much appreciated, and just reiterating Shaw's comments, so thank you.
Okay, so has everybody booked their French tickets? So, sorry to bring you all down to reality, but this is, I'm afraid, the reality in the UK at the moment. So, the perennial contract reform. I think this has been going on probably as long as I can remember. There is and there remains an ongoing government commitment to contract reform. It's in their manifesto. They are committed to dental contract reform. BDA met with the new Minister of Dentistry, and the Minister's changed fairly rapidly at the moment. Seema Kennedy, she's committed to contract reform. Matt Hancock is committed to prevention and contract reform. It fits the long-term plan. It fits the 5-year forward view. And they are committed to making it happen. The question is when. And we share as much frustration as all of you in the room as to when this is going to happen. We're discussing detail. We're less optimistic about 2020. We think it is likely to be delayed until 2021. And I'll come on to why that may happen. And I think we're talking about a gradual, phased rollout at that time. What they're terrified about is the big bang where everybody converts to the reformed contract and they create a lot of problems. So I think it will be a phased approach. So there's been quite a lot agreed already, and this was presented at LDC Officials Day in December. But there's been further development since then. So contract reform, as most of you in the room will know, will be based around capitation. GDPC policy is that we'd like 100% capitation, but we'd certainly like as much capitation as possible. And I'll talk in a little bit about blends and options. It'll be for a 3-year capitation period. We think that fits with the prevention program. And what they're doing at the moment is gathering data to make meaningful decisions about the weighting of capitation. Weighted capitation is designed to produce financial support for the practice that will reflect treatment need. And so it will be based around deprivation, a postcode for that patient, age, and the sex of the patient for adults. So in essence, the same patient who needs the same level of treatment in any part of the country will get the same capitation fee. So there will be weighted capitation. Non-capitated activity. So in Blend A, 60% of the contract is based around capitation, 40% of it around activity. Blend B, 85% capitation, 15% activity. So the non-capitated activity, what they're going to do is to use data from all practices to try and create a more equal system for activity measurement and to try and eliminate some of the gross disparities. And it's a time to talk about the exchange mechanism that they're talking about within the new contract. So if you're under-delivering on activity, you'll be able to make that up in the form of access and capitation. To do it the other way around, you would need to seek permission for that. They're very, very jumpy about access. And the split of your contract value, the overall contract value will remain the same. The split in that contract value will be based on your current practice profile. So each individual practice has a different profile. The amount of contract that is dedicated to capitation and activity will be determined by your current practice contract profile. Okay, a few outstanding areas. So there's obviously Blend A and Blend B. Our preferred approach is Blend B. We think it fits with the prevention model, with the pathway that they're envisaging happening in practice. It must be for the choice of practices. If they roll both blends out, I think we're of the view that give us Blend B and we'll go with that. But if they choose to roll out both blends, it must be for the practices to decide which blend they go for. And that's a red line for us. I just wanted to talk a little bit about how they potentially are going to roll this out. As I said earlier, I don't think it's going to be a big bang. I think you will see a phased approach, and it's how they design that phased approach. And we're having some quite detailed discussions at the moment. One of the thoughts is to divide the population up by age in terms of age tranches, and potentially maybe roll out the children initially. As I said earlier, what they're worried about is where everybody goes into the system on day one with all patients. And you can imagine as a practice that becomes quite difficult to manage. So it would give an opportunity for practices to get used to the new way of working, the new pathway, perhaps the skill mix issue as well. It will give practices time. So that's something that we're exploring at the moment, the timing and the nature of that rollout. Future activity payments is a real, for us, this is a real issue. We don't like UDAs, as you know. And to be honest with you, I don't think they like UDAs either. But it's what we're going to replace that with, and we're working on that at the moment. We're pushing quite hard for work to be done on that. And the transition that I talked about is all about trying to ensure that practices don't fall off a cliff, have chance of success, have chance to learn how to work and make this thing work effectively for patients and practices. So that's a very brief resume of where we are. Dave's going to have a talk now about a few things, and then I'll come back to you.
Thanks, Sean. Thank you. Really just summarising a lot of what Sean said and where our negotiation objectives are. As Sean says, we do favour Blend B. I personally would like as much capitation as we can. I would like to have item of service as the activity measure, not the current UDAs. And it's really important. Their line is at the moment, behind the scenes, that they would like to dictate, if you go into the prototypes, are you going to be A or B? That's quite clearly not acceptable. The choice has to be made out. The transition arrangements have yet to be determined, and that's part of the finance reference group, which Henrik was a part of that, and obviously BDA staff as well. And in that transition process, are we going to be still guaranteed our practice income? The timing of the rollout, one of the things they're very twitchy is about, that we have finally agreed to have some weighted form of capitation. But of course, if you have a weighted form of capitation, so you might get the difference in value between low needs and high needs as much as 2 times, How do that fit in to the non-capitated amount? To the capitated amount, sorry. So if you have high needs patients, have a whole influx of new high needs patients that might be worth twice the value because of the amount of work that they need done, that's going to affect that pot of the 60% for blend A that Sean alluded to. How does that affect you? Because you're going to increase that size of that value. Does that therefore mean you have to do less activity? Or do you have an increasing total contract value? That balancing act and the mechanisms which the prototypes are using at the moment needs very careful looking after. And that balancing act at the moment, this mechanism, is clearly not working, which I'll allude to in a moment. So we do need to shift away from the UDA system. They said that that will happen, but they haven't given us timeframes. In a recent meeting, that's not been guaranteed. We can't put that towards the profession and to you guys unless we have some guarantee of when we get rid of this useless system. This comes from the second report of the financial sustainability, the evaluation report that's produced by Eric Rooney. And even looking at, sorry, I beg your pardon, it's not come up. Thank you. We can see here, we've got comparisons of 16-17 against 17-18. Taking the percentages below 96%, how can you call wave 3 a success and 25% are having clawback? 19% of wave 2s, 30% of wave 1s. Something's not right, quite clearly. But even more worrying in why we get 20% of wave 3s, 31% of wave 2s, and 26% of wave 3s, in excess of 102%. They're working for nothing. So why is there such a huge variance between those that are failing and those that are actually failing because they're doing too much? So again, this exchange mechanism. So the financial model clearly needs to be looked at, and that's an ongoing process to make this a sustainable business model. And there needs to be greater flexibility on the patient's numbers. There's huge variation in patients' numbers for the same sort of contract values. Historically, their targets, the pressure needs to be taken off practices. And they need to be given a much better chance of hitting targets. And I hate the word targets. Time is the most important thing to produce outcome. And that clearly is still not being done under this process. So there's much work to be done. Negotiations continue. I mentioned the financial reference group, the remuneration group, and the other working groups, which then feed back to the national steering group, which both Sean and I are members of, for us to decide. And we will not agree any process that we can't put it to you members. The BDA have also produced a nice fact sheet, which is there readily and available. And this will be updated at regular intervals. But a lot of the questions are on that. And I urge you, you may have this in the future notes, just to look at any questions, and hopefully you'll get the answers you need. That concludes our bit at the moment on contract reform. And I think we'll go on to the next stage of recruitment and retention.
Okay, so recruitment and retention, I genuinely do think that's a crisis in many parts of the country. I think you'd agree with me. I know all about this. I'm a practitioner in Lincolnshire, and it is a crisis. So this came about as a result of a motion from Nick Stoles asking us to do some work on recruitment, retention, and the BDA have done that. So, as I say, I'm very familiar with this in Lincolnshire. We've had a situation where two practices successfully tendered, but they were unable to open their doors to see patients because they couldn't recruit dentists. And of course, it's not just new practices, it's existing practices that are unable to meet contract. So they're suffering from clawback, financial instability. We know the scenarios, and it is a crisis. It's getting worse. So you can see from the slide that, and I'm actually a bit surprised it's only 75%, struggling to recruit an associate. So lots of unfilled vacancies. Agencies are reporting it's difficult for them to get hold of performers to fill roles. Is it worth advertising? It's quite expensive to do. I talk to practitioners, they say, I'm not sure it's worth doing. But what do you do? The situation is worsening. It's increased over the last 3 years, and it's more of a problem in NHS practices than private practices, but not exclusively. There are some parts of the country where it's difficult to get to a dentist to any practice. So you see from the slide, 60% of practice owners want to leave the service. Again, I wouldn't think there are that many who haven't thought about it at least once, so, and maybe off to France. So I might see you there. So people wanting to scale down their NHS commitment. So morale is low, we know that, and it's not surprising.